Welcome to this presentation. I'm Russell Endo, and I am a retired professor of sociology and Asian American studies at the University of Colorado. I am also the primary researcher for the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition. Many people know about the World War II mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, but fewer people know what happened beforehand, the incarceration of thousands of Japanese, German, and Italian immigrants. Knowing about this is important for a complete understanding of the injustices of this war. In this presentation, I will describe what took place, but also how this process unfolded. I will cover the main points in a start-to-finish manner. I'm going to focus on what happened to the Japanese in one region, Santa Barbara County in California. But such events occurred in hundreds of places throughout the United States and affected Germans and Italians as well as Japanese. Before talking about World War II, I want to briefly discuss pre-war Japanese in Santa Barbara County. Japanese settlement in Santa Barbara County occurred in and around four towns, Guadalupe, Santa Maria, and Lompoc at the left side of this map, and in the city of Santa Barbara on the right side. Significant Japanese migration began in the early 1900s. Many Japanese in the northern part of the county were involved in farming, first as laborers and then as farmers. Japanese immigrants were forbidden by law from owning land, so they leased farmland from white property owners. The Japanese in Guadalupe, Santa Maria, and Lompoc were pioneers in the fresh vegetable industry. Japanese farmers grew crops such as celery, tomatoes, peas, carrots, spinach, cabbage, broccoli, lettuce, and cauliflower. This picture was taken by noted photographer Dorothea Lange. Agricultural products were shipped to Southern California and elsewhere in the U.S. Four Japanese grower-shippers dominated this industry. Japanese in the northern part of Santa Barbara County generally experienced less animosity from whites than occurred in other parts of California. Whites benefited from leasing land to the Japanese and selling them farm and other products. By 1940, a majority of the Japanese population were American-born children of the Japanese immigrants. These children attended public schools and were more Americanized than their immigrant parents. Santa Maria and Lompoc were more settled communities of families than Guadalupe, and they had higher proportions of Japanese employed in non-farm occupations. Japanese settlement in the southern part of Santa Barbara County occurred in and around the city of Santa Barbara. Some Japanese worked as small farmers growing produce. Others were employed in the small Japantown. Many worked for wealthy white residents as gardeners, cooks, and domestics. Many Santa Barbara Japanese lived on the estates of their employers in Montecito and Mission Canyon. They developed close personal relationships with their employers. Because of these social ties and the non-threatening nature of the small Japanese population, pre-war relationships between whites and Japanese in the city of Santa Barbara were generally friendly. Let's take a closer look at the pre-war Japantown sections of Guadalupe, Santa Maria, Lompoc, and Santa Barbara. In and around each of these towns, the Japanese population was large enough to support a range of businesses and institutions. Examples of these were Buddhist and Christian churches. There were groceries, hotels, and restaurants. And there were automobile garages. Also boarding houses, doctors' and dentists' offices, tailors, florists, drugstores, laundries, pool halls, fish markets, barber shops, and Japanese organizations and language schools. The next two slides contain maps of the Japan towns of Guadalupe and Santa Barbara, produced by the Japantown Atlas Project. In 1940, the Japanese population of Guadalupe was 933, while that of Santa Barbara was 375. According to the California Japantowns Project, before World War II, there were about 50 Japanese businesses and institutions in Guadalupe, 40 in Santa Maria, 20 in Lompoc, and 40 in the city of Santa Barbara. In the 1940 census, the Japanese population of Santa Barbara County was 2,187. I want to talk now about U.S. government plans before World War II. During the 1930s, U.S. officials were concerned about the growing strength and aggressiveness of Japan, Germany, and Italy. Plans were developed to safeguard the internal security of the United States. One plan was to create lists of individuals in the U.S. who would be arrested in the event of a war. The best known was the Custodial Detention Index, created by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Lists were also compiled by the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Army's Military Intelligence Division. The Special Defense Unit was in charge of evaluating individuals. It used three main categories, A, B, and C, with A being the most dangerous. Suspicious Japanese, German, and Italian organizations in America were put into these three categories. Organization officials and members were then given individual A, B, or C classifications. For Japanese, such persons included religious, business, and other community leaders, and members of organizations with ties to Japan. However, the FBI continued to evaluate individuals on its own. FBI arrest lists also included Japanese in occupations seen as dangerous, such as fishermen and Japanese language school teachers. In Southern California, FBI investigations of Japanese organizations resulted in numerous memoranda and reports. These were to be used as reference material in the arrest and incarceration of individuals. This slide shows an example of one major FBI intelligence report written in May 1941. In 1940, the government required all adult non-citizens to register and be fingerprinted. Just after the start of the war, in 1942, all non-citizens from enemy nations had to register. Let's turn now to World War II. When the war began, President Franklin Roosevelt issued presidential proclamations 2525, 2526, and 2527. This allowed the government to incarcerate non-citizens, or enemy aliens, from Japan, Germany, and Italy. It also authorized curfews, travel restrictions, and the exclusion of enemy aliens from designated areas, for example around ports, airports, rail yards, power plants, and military facilities. Possession of items such as firearms, cameras, and shortwave radios was forbidden. On December 7, 1941, the FBI began arresting Japanese, Germans, and Italians throughout the United States. After 11 days, over 1,400 Japanese, 1,200 Germans, and 200 Italians had been arrested. FBI action in Santa Barbara County was also swift. On December 7th and 8th, 1941, 14 Japanese immigrant leaders were arrested by the FBI in Guadalupe, Santa Maria, and Lombok. Within 2 weeks, 2 more Japanese and 1 German were also arrested. Because of limited space at Department of Justice detention facilities, these 17 men were held in the Santa Barbara County Jail. This slide and the next one contain very important documents. This slide shows a contract invitation to the Santa Barbara County Sheriff for the detention of enemy aliens in the Santa Barbara County Jail. This slide shows the award of this contract. From December 9th to December 20th, 1941, the Santa Barbara County Jail was, by this contract, a World War II Department of Justice incarceration facility. And the city of Santa Barbara was one of the many places in the United States where Japanese and Germans were officially confined during the war. The 16 Japanese in the Santa Barbara County Jail were sent to the San Pedro Detention Station. Some were later transferred to the Tuna Canyon Detention Station. I will talk more about Tuna Canyon later. All Japanese arrested in Southern California were to have hearings in Los Angeles. But General John D. Witt of the Western Defense Command wanted enemy aliens, especially Japanese, moved away from the West Coast. So the 16 Japanese, along with others, were sent to the Fort Missoula, Montana detention camp on December 16th and 25th. This was the first of many removals of Japanese from Southern California. Other actions were taken against Japanese immigrants in Santa Barbara County. The California Highway Patrol set up roadblocks and searched cars occupied by Japanese. 14 more Japanese immigrants were arrested in January and February 1942. All were sent to Tuna Canyon. These early arrests sent shockwaves throughout Santa Barbara County Japanese communities. People felt threatened and that they were under constant government surveillance. This had a chilling effect on community activities. In early 1942, the distinguished African-American attorney Hugh Macbeth went to Guadalupe and the city of Santa Barbara to investigate the arrests of Japanese. He discovered no evidence of disloyalty. Macbeth instead found that these arrests had been promoted by white agricultural interests who wanted to take over Japanese farmland. Santa Barbara County District Attorney Percy Heckendorf also stirred up anti-Japanese sentiment. He argued that Japanese posed a security threat. To bolster his case, Heckendorf used maps showing the proximity of Japanese farmland in Santa Barbara County to oil fields, an army base, and critical infrastructure. What he neglected to say was that the Japanese were working in this area long before these things were built. In February 1942, the FBI began mass arrests of Japanese immigrants in parts of Southern California. Santa Barbara County's turn came in mid-February. This document shows that FBI targets included leaders of local Japanese associations. But these organizations were not a threat to the internal security of the United States. So the FBI was arresting innocent people. This document shows that FBI targets included members of two so-called Japanese patriotic societies. However, these organizations were not engaged in any subversive activity. So again, the FBI was arresting innocent people. FBI targets in Santa Barbara County also included leaders of religious and farm organizations. On February 18th, 142 men were arrested, primarily in Guadalupe and the Santa Maria Valley. On February 19th, 112 men were arrested in the same areas, as well as in Lompoc and the city of Santa Barbara. 11 more men were arrested the next day. The total number of arrests was 265. This was the second largest FBI raid conducted on the Pacific Coast. About 50 men were not immediately arrested for various reasons. Some, for example, were away from home on business or other work, and there were errors on FBI arrest lists. About 50 FBI agents, county sheriffs, local police, and California Highway Patrol officers made these arrests. Arrested men were taken by the Army and military trucks to the Santa Barbara County Jail. These arrests were covered by local and Los Angeles newspapers. From government documents, I have discovered that the information newspapers reported was not always accurate. Of the 265 arrested men, 217 were transferred to Tuna Canyon. The rest were sent to the San Pedro Detention Station. And the FBI was not finished with Santa Barbara County. On March 13th, the FBI conducted a mass arrest of over 250 Japanese language school teachers in Southern California. In Santa Barbara County, 12 people were arrested. Among these were a husband and wife and 2 Buddhist priests. All of the men were transferred to Tuna Canyon. FBI arrests in Santa Barbara County finally ended with the apprehension of 4 men in early April. In Lompoc, Daisho Tana was a new Buddhist priest. He and his wife taught in the church's language school. Daisho Tana was arrested on March 13th. He kept a detailed diary of his wartime experiences. Here is how Daisho Tana described his arrest. The person who will be reading this and other parts of Tana's diary is Nancy Oda, the president of the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition.
These arrests happened because of the DICE Committee's report that accused the language schools of being anti-American organizations. Thus, we see the arrest as well as the confiscation of the school's textbooks. Of course, these organizations taught second-generation students not only the language, but also Japanese values. But somehow, the Americans do not accept the fact that these schools also teach students to be sincere and faithful to the U.S. During this war between the U.S. and Japan, there is not a single language school administrator who ran their school to somehow benefit Japan. They simply taught that being an American of Japanese ancestry should not mean that they are inferior to white Americans. This should be something Americans find agreeable.
In total, 310 Japanese immigrant men and 1 woman were arrested. Most of the Japanese immigrant men in Santa Barbara County were arrested. They left behind wives and children who suddenly had to fend for themselves. These arrests removed nearly all of the senior leaders of Japanese communities. Japanese families and communities in Santa Barbara County were vulnerable to the rising tide of anti-Japanese racism. As we have seen, the first prison camp for most Santa Barbara County detainees was the Tuna Canyon Detention Station. Tuna Canyon was located within the city of Los Angeles, in Tujunga, about 14 miles northwest of the Los Angeles City Hall. Tuna Canyon was one of two key confinement sites in the earliest forced removal of Japanese from Southern California. Before the war, plans were made to incarcerate enemy aliens from Southern California in San Pedro. A search was conducted for a second site. Several places in Los Angeles and Ventura counties were considered. Just before the war, an unused Civilian Conservation Corps camp in Tujunga was selected. Hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, this camp was turned over to the Department of Justice. On December 16, 1941, Tuna Canyon received its first prisoners. This is how Daisho Tana described his arrival at Tuna Canyon.
The camp was surrounded by barbed wire fences 10 feet high. We went through luggage inspection, and I was assigned to Barrack F. Dinner tonight was a Japanese meal and included hot miso soup. I felt so relieved while eating it. There was an inspection count of the Japanese at 8:30 p.m., and lights were off at 10 p.m. I recited Buddhist texts quietly on my bed in the dark. It was too cold to fall asleep, but I slept well after wrapping my body in a blanket. I woke up in the CCC temporary internment camp in Tujunga. Rain last night turned to snow on the mountains. Woke up at 6 a.m. At 6:45, guard inspection. 7 a.m., breakfast and room cleaning. 10:45, guard inspection. At noon, lunch. 4:15, guard inspection. 5 p.m., dinner. 8:30, guard inspection. 10 p.m., lights out. Living in this collective and ordered environment made me think of regimented military life. We had to stay 10 feet away from the barbed wire fence. Being cut off from the outside is the most painful thing about being in camp.
Tuna Canyon had 6 barracks, which could house up to 300 prisoners. Tuna Canyon had an office building, an infirmary, and a recreation building. The recreation building had a library, and it was used for Buddhist and Christian religious services and to show movies. This is the Tuna Canyon Mess Hall. Detainee cooks were allowed to prepare meals. Tuna Canyon prisoners were guarded by Border Patrol officers. This guard station had a view of the vehicle entrance. Merrill Scott was in charge of running Tuna Canyon. Here he is seen with Willard Kelly. Kelly was in charge of the Department of Justice detention and internment. Family members were allowed to visit detainees at certain times. Here is one of Daisho Tana's descriptions of visitors.
Visitors came at 1 p.m. Visitors are permitted on Sundays and Wednesdays. After the brief 30-minute visit, detainees near the fence and their families in a bicycle parking lot waved to each other, all in tears. How could one communicate through a grate during the 30-minute visit? A fellow internee who could speak English was required to be present to translate if one could only speak Japanese. Prisoners and families could only touch their fingers through the grate. I can only imagine how the families felt seeing their husbands or fathers in prison. Many detainees did not sleep that night after lights out. Letting them see their families in this unsatisfactory way is not necessarily kindness.
Detainees maintained vegetable gardens. At one time they had a cornfield. There was a wood shop where small items could be made. One detainee made inkstands, which he sent to family members. Activities for detainees included playing horseshoes and baseball. In this photograph, notice the guard tower near the fence and the watchtower on the hill. Even with such activities, thoughts of family were always present, as Daisho Tana points out.
The spring sun is shining like it might in a southern region, and those confined here are playing baseball. It is good for us to engage in activities like this and forget ourselves and our time as detainees. There must be some here who have concerns, such as the state of their family business, which they cannot discuss with others. While there is no doubt that we all have love for our families that we had to leave behind, during those twice-a-week meetings with them through the barbed wire fence, there must be many detainees who cannot but stifle their true feelings. The detainees release stress by playing baseball, but they are simultaneously tired from preparing for the next transfer and feel sad to only be able to encounter their wives who bring them delicious food by entwining their fingers for 3 minutes through the barbed wire while guards look over them.
During the war, over 2,000 people were detained at Tuna Canyon. These included Japanese, Germans, and Italians from the United States, and 207 brought to this country from Latin America. The last prisoners left Tuna Canyon at the end of October 1943. After Tuna Canyon, most Santa Barbara County Japanese were sent to detention camps in Montana, North Dakota, or New Mexico. Daisho Tana was transferred from Tuna Canyon to Santa Fe, New Mexico in March 1942. At these new detention camps, Japanese were given a hearing to determine their fate. However, hearings were not trials. There was no due process. There were no judges, only a board of 2 or 3 civilians. Detainees were not allowed to have lawyers. They did not know in advance what accusations or evidence would be presented. They were not allowed to do any cross-examination. I have examined the records for several hundred hearings. Some hearings were short, others lasted hours. Some hearing boards tried to make objective decisions, but many hearing boards uncritically accepted government allegations of detainee disloyalty, and detainees were presumed to be guilty unless they could prove their innocence. At Daisho Tana's hearing, the hearing board recommended his permanent internment. Tana was sent to the Army internment camp at Lordsburg, New Mexico. In June 1943, he was transferred back to Santa Fe. During Daisho Tana's incarceration, all of the remaining Japanese residents of Santa Barbara County, including Tana's wife and children, were removed from their homes at the end of April 1942. They were first sent to the Tulare Detention Facility. In August, most were transferred to the Gila River, Arizona War Relocation Authority camp. This was part of the mass incarceration of West Coast Japanese that included immigrants and their American-born children. Daisho Tana was not released to rejoin his family until after the end of World War II. Family separation was one of the most devastating consequences of the incarceration of Japanese immigrants. Emotional responses to separation were conveyed in many ways. Here is a poem written by Daisho Tana's wife, which was sent to him while he was at Tuna Canyon. This poem and material on the next slide will be read by Nancy Hayata, a board member of the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition.
If I open my eyes, I can see my husband. Even if I close them, my husband appears as mine. Shackled, give me wings so that I can go to where my husband sleeps. I try to be strong, but a wife's attachments never end, day and night. Waking up in the middle of the night, thinking I caught a glimpse of him. It was just the shadow of a pillow.
Detainee family members pleaded with high government officials. The most poignant letters were written by young children. Here are excerpts from 2 letters on behalf of detainees who were not from Santa Barbara County.
Last week a letter came from my father saying that he would not be able to come home to us anymore. My mother is about to have a baby. I am 8 years old. During that time, I will have to take care of the other children, and it would be very hard for me. So we would like our father to come back, please. My father hasn't done anything bad. We know that, so we wonder why he doesn't come home. Since my father has been gone, we have been very sad. For our sake, will you please let our father come home right away? When is my father going to be released? Many people who have gone into camp the same time as him have come back, but why hasn't he? My mother worries so much about my father, so she can't sleep. She might get sick, so please try to release him. I am only 12. Will you please answer this letter, for I will be waiting.
I want to conclude by pointing out that the arrest and incarceration of Japanese, German, and Italian non-citizens at the beginning of World War II was legal, although this power was greatly abused by the government. The legal basis was the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which was recodified in 1918. This slide shows part of this law. This law is triggered by a presidential proclamation following a declaration of war or an actual, attempted, or threatened predatory incursion by a hostile nation or government. Note that an actual attack on the United States is not necessary. All that is required is what a president decides is an external threat. This gives presidents immense power, which can be used in the future against any non-citizen groups in the U.S. they see as threats to national security. Before I end, I want to reiterate that I have focused on Japanese in one region, Santa Barbara County. But such events during World War II occurred in hundreds of places throughout the United States, and to Germans and Italians as well as Japanese. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Please feel free to contact me at any time with questions or comments.